This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
An African-American father and son's pursuit to make it to the big leagues of NASCAR. Lenny Miller, the author of Racing While Black, on this edition of Conversations. From the mid-1990s to the latter part of this decade, the business of NASCAR was growing faster than a Sprint Cup car on a straightaway at Daytona. Huge television contracts rolled in. New tracks were constructed in major markets outside the southeastern U.S., and the sponsorship dollars were flowing. A one-time Southern sport made up of good old boys had gone big time. The sport had grown and expanded its base. While blue-collar hero Dale Earnhardt still reigned supreme, a young Californian named Jeff Gordon brought in a new audience that challenged the traditional stereotypes associated with NASCAR. The racing series had grown to be one of the most popular sports in the nation. But something was missing: the presence of an African-American driver at the series' top level. Racing While Black is the story of a father and son who had hoped to change that. The author is Lenny Miller, and he's our guest on this edition of Conversations. Lenny, welcome.
Hey, thanks a lot, Jeff.
Before we get into what the book's all about, tell me what it was that got you interested in racing to begin with.
Well, I grew up with auto racing. My father, he was a hot rodder in the 50s with his 40 Ford convertible. He grew up outside of Philadelphia, and was even a charter member of the George Barris Customs Club in Los Angeles that was expanding nationwide. And then he started to grow into NHR racing, drag racing, in the 60s with the Volvo P1800. And then him and his brothers built a 55 Chevrolet station wagon and drag raced that in NHRA, primarily in the Englishtown, New Jersey, Atco, New Jersey area. And then as 1970 rolled around, my father had a larger idea to get an African-American driver in the Indy 500. So he recruited African-American driver Benny Scott from Los Angeles, and they raced in Formula A racing and Formula 5000 racing in 1972, and he created a team called Black American Racers. So as a kid, I grew up at racetracks like Watkins Glen, New York, Lime Rock, Connecticut, Road Atlanta, and different road circuits on the East Coast. And as a kid, watching cars doing 190 miles an hour at Watkins Glen and drivers from all over the world was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And my father ended up putting a car in the Indy 500 with a white driver, John Mailer, in 1972. So my father was the first African-American owner to own a team that competed in the Indy 500. And as they progressed, my father started a team with a Formula 5000 car, Lola T332, that was imported from England through Carl Haas, which his name is known around IndyCar circles and sports car circles.
Newman Haas.
Yeah, Newman Haas. Paul Newman came on later with Carl Haas years later. And they competed in the first Long Beach Grand Prix in 1975 with Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company as a sponsor with their Viceroy cigarette brand. So they competed against Al Unser, Mario Andretti, Jody Scheckter from South Africa, and a lot of different drivers from around the world. And these cars were doing, 210 miles an hour at Long Beach in 1975. And the Formula 5000 series, during that year, those cars were actually faster than Formula One cars in Europe in the mid-70s. So growing up, I had an interest in driving. I tried to drive myself. I had a dream of being a race car driver, but my mother kind of squashed that at the go-kart level. And then I was on the same track as a traditional kid. You try all the stick and ball sports, and you end up going to college and doing something else.
And what was it that started attracting you guys to the NASCAR side of things?
Basically by default, my father had a driver killed at the Trenton Speedway in September of 1978. His name was Tommy Thompson, and it was in the Formula Super V series. It was a mini Indy series, they called it. It was a training ground, one of the training grounds for drivers to groom themselves for IndyCar racing. And so everything kind of stopped after Tommy Thompson's death. And then my father had a driver knock on his door in New Jersey named Bruce Driver. His last name was Driver. And he came up through the go-karts. He was 19 years old. And he wanted to build an open-wheel stock car that raced on the dirt in Flemington, New Jersey. So the father started all over again at the grassroots level in the dirt with Bruce Driver. And they won about 8 races that year in 1980. And but they still didn't have the sponsorship to go further and reach the next level. So everything kind of stopped for about 5 or 6 years. And then my father and I decided, well, let's try to start an IndyCar effort. And when we went into corporations around the late 80s, 1990, as you stated in the introduction, NASCAR was starting to explode.
Right. And
the corporations didn't even want to entertain an open wheel racing, sports car racing categories. Everything was NASCAR. Right. So we tried to find an African-American driver that we could groom for NASCAR and start at the grassroots level.
Now, tell us a little bit about your story here in the book, because the book's almost a business story as much as it is a sports story in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the first driver we had in 1990 from Massachusetts was Chris Woods, and we took him from Massachusetts down to North Carolina. So my father and I, we started out with our own money, like most teams. You know, I bought an engine for $15,000 plus. Father bought the chassis, and then we had a small race shop at Concord, North Carolina, at the Concord Motor Speedway at that time. And then we got a call from my father had a friend called Joe Gerber that was a racing promoter in the Northeast, and he called my father and he said, hey, we have this African-American kid that's 20 years old up in Massachusetts. It was Agawam, Massachusetts, at the I think it was Riverside Speedway, and I think he'd be a perfect candidate for you guys to take down to North Carolina. So my father actually flew up to Massachusetts with a friend of his, a private airplane, met Chris, and he was very enthusiastic, wanted to head to Charlotte, North Carolina, like most aspiring stock car drivers, and try to make it in the stock car world. So our experiences and ambition matched up perfectly. So we take Chris Woods, who had this New England JFK accent, and we take him down to North Carolina to race at the Concord Motor Speedway with our own money and a late model stock car, and to get him up to speed.
And to give our audience kind of an idea, probably most people watch NASCAR and they see Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Johnson and these guys, and they're at the highest level. They're at the Sprint Cup level. But I guess you use a baseball analogy, that would be like the major leagues. And
right.
As you go down, you got the nationwide series, and then you were down, so like maybe a like single A or double A ball team. Right. Yeah. So that's where it all kind of starts, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you know, the African-American drivers, you're not going to find them at the top levels. They're right. usually at the grassroots level or non-existent. So you have to start at the grassroots level to groom the driver. So we started out again with our own money, and then of course we knew we need sponsorship. So we started pitching to corporations to sponsor our team at the grassroots level with like a 5-year plan to get to the top levels.
What sort of issues did you run into with the sponsorships?
Well, with corporations, I mean, in general, everyone would agree that sponsorship is very hard to attain for anyone. Right. But from a marketing standpoint, we thought with an African-American team and driver, we would stand out in the marketplace in NASCAR and actually get more attention and have more appeal from a marketing standpoint than the traditional drivers. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we would pitch our business plan and proposals to corporations, but 9 times out of 10, they would fall on deaf ears, or we would get directed to diversity divisions, and we would be pushed out of the marketing division. Mm-hmm. And the diversity divisions basically are mechanisms in corporate America to show that they're good citizens in the public and have photo ops, and it keeps Reverend Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton off their doorsteps. Right. But it's not a division that sponsors race cars. So 9 times out of 10, we were diverted to diversity.
Your driver was talented though, Chris.
Yeah, he was Rookie of the Year. He ran in the top 10 right out of the box. right into the top 5 very quickly. He would lead laps. So he was very talented. We thought he would be, which it's nationwide now, but we in the Busch series, we thought he would be there in 2 years or less from late model.
Why didn't he?
Basically, the sponsorship. I mean, that's the only thing that impeded us from progressing was sponsorship. We did get sponsorship from General Motors and then later on Dr. Pepper at the late model level, but we could not get the sponsorship to go to the next level, like the Truck Series or the Nationwide Series.
A lot of people might not realize just how expensive it is to get a race car, and even at the what we would call at the late model level. Give us an idea of what it costs to field a competitive late model car.
Yeah, if you ask different people, you get different numbers all over the place. But at late model, at the grassroots level, I mean, you're into a 6-figure number, and depending on what series in the late model division or category, you could reach $300,000–400,000 a year. At that level, and you're just Saturday night racing. You're not on television. There's not a lot of radio coverage, and that's what it costs. And that's what prevents a lot of people from entering the sport is the cost of the sport.
You know, NASCAR in recent times has had a drive on for diversity and all, and I'd read in the book that you guys went and met with, Bill France, for example, and Humpy Wheeler, and I was kind of curious, you say in the book here, Humpy Wheeler, who was well known for basically the big promoter at Charlotte Motor Speedway, which is one of the premier tracks on the NASCAR circuit. He was pretty open to having an African-American driver in the series, from what I read in the book. Expand on that.
Yeah, he did, and he had the Legends series, and they had a summer shootout series with the Legends cars, which Chris Woods, and we did meet with Humpy Wheeler also in some of the meetings with Chris. He did race some of the Legends races at the Charlotte Motor Speedway. But Humpy Wheeler, yeah, he was open. He was more of an innovative promoter, probably one of the most innovative promoters in NASCAR. But still, we still had to go to the corporations to get the sponsorship to get Chris or any other African-American driver, out on the racetrack at the higher levels.
So was your issue probably, it was more of a challenge dealing with corporate America than, say, the NASCAR folks?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, at the racetracks when we would show up as African-Americans, I mean, not all the competitors, not all the fans, but it was noticeable that we were kind of shaking the tree, so to speak, and we even heard people whisper, hey, the Tiger Woods has golf, Serena Williams and Venus Williams are taking over tennis. This is all we have. What? Are we going to lose this too? I mean, we would hear that repeatedly. But yeah, you have to have corporate sponsorship to show up at the racetracks.
Right, because the money makes the world turn, doesn't it?
I mean, that's the way it goes. And we focused on that. I mean, we went to, we probably at least 60 corporations in a 15-year span.
Wow. Why? What was their reasoning behind it? I mean, did they ever give you a solid reason to come? Because obviously, I mean, African Americans buy product just like everyone else.
Yeah, but we have the reasons. They span from just a brush off that we don't have the money in our budget. Come back next year. Some of the reasons are, well, NASCAR's basically an all-white sport. There's not any African Americans in the grandstand, so why would we sponsor an African American team or driver? Then I would have a response that, when you see Tiger Woods play golf in at least, live audience, or Serena Williams hit the tennis ball at the U.S. Open, if you look at the audience, it's pretty much 99% white. I mean, African Americans appeal to everyone, but that's one of the excuses we would get. Then another one we would get from an oil company. They would sponsor. Their budget was about $200 million a year for the world, from Formula One all the way to NASCAR, drag racing, into the grassroots, just for auto racing. They told us they donated $1 million to the Martin Luther King statue in Washington. Therefore, they don't need to sponsor a race team. And then they would end the meeting, and then that was the end of it. And maybe come back next year if some of their strategies have changed.
Interesting. I look, and for example, Lewis Hamilton, African American, Formula One champion. So I mean, other forms of racing, and not to say anything negative on NASCAR from that standpoint, but more I guess, why have the sponsors been more open to, say, Formula One than NASCAR?
Well, I think in Europe and different places in the world, on some social issues, they're more open and less threatened to let an underdog or an African American or some type of minority enter the sport. Yeah. And then Lewis Hamilton was a winner at the go-kart level and really showed unique talent. And I think McLaren Formula One, they signed him at the go-kart level. I think he was 13 years old, and they groomed him up through the ranks. So Europe and England, they're actually a little bit ahead of America on social issues and being open to letting everyone compete.
Danica Patrick has obviously made some inroads, both, you know, well, IndyCar's had women for quite some time. None of them really as successful as she has been, and now she's kind of moved over into the NASCAR on the Nationwide Series. What are your thoughts on her, and can she shatter that glass ceiling, so to speak?
I think she has to a point. I mean, she's definitely motivated other women to get involved in all types of racing. But if you look at Danica Patrick from a marketing standpoint, I mean, she carried the IndyCar series probably for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
She was the big story. She added spice to the whole series. And I think that's, in this day and time, I think that's what any minority, especially if they're competitive,
right,
they would add to NASCAR or any series. And from a business standpoint, that's good business. It's going to attract more fans, not just minority fans, but fans across the board.
I know that NASCAR is involved with the Drive for Diversity, and there's a gentleman by the name of Max Siegel who for a while was the head of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. I think their global operations or whatnot, and he is really involved in NASCAR. Is he someone who can start to change the lay of the land?
I know he's involved. I don't know the details of the program. I know there's a reality show that was kind of affiliated with the Drive for Diversity. There is a program, and I think the diversity program, and I don't know the exact year, but I think it's been in existence at NASCAR for at least 7 years. But there hasn't been any results to date showing a driver coming out of the diversity program and being a competitor in the truck series or the Nationwide series and going up the ranks. Now, that may happen in the next year or two. We'll have to see. But the program has not, it's been a revolving door. And I think it's, in my opinion, is modeled after a 1980 corporate America diversity program where it's set up for photo ops and kind of a feel-good situation, but you don't see the drivers out on the track at the higher levels. And at the grassroots level, African American drivers have won races. They've been Rookie of the Year. They have led laps. They've competed, and a lot of those statistics have been satisfied, so to speak, at the grassroots level. It's looking at the top 3 levels of NASCAR where you want to see the African American driver compete on a sustainable basis. There's been flash in the pan efforts where you'll see an African American driver in the last 10 years pop up in the truck series, and it's limited. They'll race 2 races, 5 races, maybe even a full season, then they go away.
What happened with Willie T. Ribbs? He was probably one of the most well-known African-American race car drivers that ever competed on the NASCAR side of things. Yeah,
Willie Ribbs, I think his talent was really over in sports car racing and Indy car racing, and except when I know he was with Dan Gurney back in the 80s in sports car racing, and he won a lot of races, but he had a good team with Dan Gurney, properly sponsored by Toyota. And then when he made his IndyCar effort in the early 90s, again, it was a lack of sponsorship. I think he got a couple handouts from some corporations after he qualified. And then when he went over to NASCAR, I don't want to say he's too old, but he's kind of ran his course in IndyCar racing, sports car racing, and I don't think he had all the financial support when he made his debut, I know, in the truck series. And I wouldn't say, I think he actually raced a few cup races in the late 80s. And then maybe 99 or 2000, he did race at least a season in the truck series, but I don't think he had all the financial support that he needed to be competitive.
In your opinion, what needs to be done differently? What would help bring young African Americans up through the ranks?
Well, one thing on the racetrack, if they had a role model or someone at the top levels, like Danica Patrick has done for women, that would help. looking at the family side, all racing, whether it's drag racing, NASCAR, IndyCar racing, it's a family sport. A lot of black drivers that my father and I have seen, and some that we've even groomed, they don't even have fathers at home. So you have to have your father, especially at the younger ages, before you have your own driver's license, take you to the racetrack, help prepare to go-kart or race car to compete. So, I mean, that's a social issue on the African-American side, but that's a problem and a dilemma to get African-American drivers to go up the rank.
Speaking of the technical side of things, in your book you talked about towards the end here that some folks like Joe Gibbs Racing and people like that are starting to embrace African Americans more, particularly on the technical engineering side. Is that an advantage to eventually getting a driver on the big league?
That's an advantage. A lot of times still with there's so many family members that have brothers and sisters in every type of racing, including NASCAR. You're usually going to be in front of the line, and the African-American driver is going to be at the end of the line, only because, I mean, if I owned a team and I have two cousins or a son that are capable of driving, I'm going to put them in the car, you know, first, you know, even if they were average drivers.
Right.
Joe Gibbs, I know he's had a driver, Chris Bristol, that they were working with in the past. He even had a mechanic, Tim Shutt, who could actually drive. I know he won races in midget cars, and he was a great mechanic and became a crew chief with Joe Gibbs. But none of those drivers ever flourished to the top levels, and they kind of went away after a few years, and no one knows what happened to them.
Interesting book. What did you take away from this experience? What did you learn from this experience?
I learned from the experience what the obstacles were in NASCAR, and I knew those obstacles existed before we got started. But what I've learned is anything is possible, and if you put a team together and at least try and make an effort to get the sponsorship and put all the components together, you can find success, because my father and I found success at the grassroots level, and the only thing that prevented us to going further is having enough sponsorship, you know, to move up the ladder.
Because it should be pointed out, I mean, you won a championship.
Yeah, we're the first African-American owners to win a championship at NASCAR, and that was at the Old Dominion Speedway in 2005. So yeah, we did have some successes that are outlined in the book, but I was motivated to write the book because over the last at least 15, 20 years, there's been at least 100 articles questioning why there's not African-American participation in the sport. Some comments some reporters have made in some of the NASCAR publications, some of the grassroots publications, that African-Americans don't even have the ability to handle a mechanical and technical arena, that they're more stick and ball, basketball players. And my book, Racing While Black, outlines my father and my story of what we did from about 1993 to 2006, but I also have some history that started in 1910 with African Americans in auto racing in America. So it shows that African Americans have been participating in the sport well before World War II, all the way to date.
Yeah. You know, it was a story of persistence. When I was reading the book, some of the things you guys put up with, I would have been like, man, I've had enough of this.
Yeah, I think most people would quit quit early on. But my father and I, we had so much money tied into the equipment, we got to the point of no return. So we tried to hang in there and see it to the end.
Tell me about your dad. He must be a special guy.
Yeah, my father, he was ahead of his time, like I outlined earlier, with black American racers, having a black team at that time with a black driver. And then he had a Chinese mechanic, Grant King, who immigrated from China, and he was pretty well known as one of the better chief mechanics in IndyCar racing in the 1960s and 70s. But my father, he had a diverse team, and they weren't trying to integrate the sport. They were just trying to compete with a African-American owned team and an African-American driver.
Right.
And then he ended up with Grant King, a Chinese chief mechanic, and they went to the Long Beach Grand Prix, and they were ranked in the top 60 teams in the world. But my father was highly educated with a master's degree in the 1950s and 60s. He served in the U.S. Army. He was drafted in the late 50s when they had a draft in America.
Right.
Everyone had to go, including Elvis Presley.
You're right.
And then he was the director of education at Rahway State Prison in the 1960s, which is still a maximum security prison, one of the toughest prisons in the U.S. And then he started a management consulting business in the late 60s and grew that business through the 70s, 80s, into the 90s. And that business gave him the seed money to start Black American racers and make a push towards the Indy 500 with a black driver. And he also sent he had a young African American driver named Coyle Peak he recruited in New York City in the early 70s. And he sent him to England for training in the Formula Ford series, the British Formula Ford series. And Coyle Peak raced under my father at Brands Hatch in England, Mallory Park, and Silverstone, which are still some of the most famous road circuits in the world.
Interesting book. A lot of interesting characters in this book. I think people will enjoy reading and kind of getting a behind-the-scenes look at what goes on to try to get a race team up to speed.
Yeah, it's, I know like Concord Motor Speedway, there was this character called Big Bird that was like, I mean, he must have been 7 foot tall. And he had these big sunglasses that covered almost half of his face and a soggy cigar. And he would run the technical inspections there, you know, 1994, 95, you know. Then Chris Woods and I would show up to tech. He's in shock that we're African American, and then he makes a derogatory comment that's kind of sensitive and funny at the same time. He said, "What'd you guys do, rob a bank?"
Goodness gracious. In about 30 seconds, what's next for you? Any more racing?
Maybe. My father and I have talked about it. I mean, we always have our ears to the ground for sponsorship. I mean, we focus on sponsorship because that's what you need. But I think we would go towards IndyCar racing at this point. I mean, that's what we personally like. That's what we started out with, and so there's a chance. We're even looking at a driver in South Africa, and that's, you know, from African descent. And there's some other drivers around the world too for you know, for IndyCar racing.
The book's available?
Yeah, the book's available at Amazon.com. You can still find it in many bookstores in the U.S. And you definitely can get it on Amazon.com, you know, online.
It's called Racing While Black. Leonard T. Miller is the author. It's a great story about racing. Takes you behind the scenes of what it's like to try to build a team. It's also a good business story. It's a wonderful story on persistence. And as we've said before, there's some interesting characters in the book. Racing While Black. Leonard Miller, thank you so much for joining us.
All right, thanks a lot, Jeff.
You bet. By the way, if you'd like to catch up with some of our past shows, you can do so. We're online at WSRE.org/conversations. Just click on the episodes tab. And of course, we have to be on Facebook. Just search Conversations with Jeff Weeks. We're out there in that social media world. We greatly appreciate you spending some time with us. I am Jeff Weeks. Take very good care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.